On a quiet evening, my daughter looked straight at me and laughed at my glasses, calling me pathetic. I adjusted the frames, but then noticed something strange in the reflection. Papers she had tried to hide. My hands froze as I read the first line. 10 minutes later, I was holding the legal notice that would change everything. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. I never thought a pair of glasses could carry so much weight. But that night they felt heavier than my whole body. I was sitting in the living room, the same room where my wife and I once celebrated birthdays and Christmases, where my children once laughed and tugged at my sleeves. The house was quiet, except for the television humming in the background. My daughter had come by, not to see me, but to collect a set of documents she had left behind. She walked in like she owned the place, her perfume sharp and uninvited, her heels clicking against the wooden floor that I had polished with my own hands for decades. She glanced at me as though I were nothing more than an old piece of furniture sitting in the corner. Her eyes landed on my glasses, those thick, round lenses that had helped me read contracts, bedtime stories, and bills that kept the roof over our heads. She laughed. Not softly, not kindly, but cruelly, with a curl of her lips that made me feel like a stranger in my own bloodline. "God, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "Those glasses make you look pathetic. No wonder people don't take you seriously anymore." I froze. My fingers gripped the arms of the chair, feeling the grooves worn into the wood over the years. I had endured many things, layoffs, broken bones, sleepless nights, but nothing sliced me quite like her words. It wasn't just about the glasses. It was about what they represented. Every hour I spent hunched over documents to pay for her tuition, every long night straining my eyes so she could walk across that graduation stage, every sacrifice I made so she could live with her head held high. And now, the very tool of my devotion had become her weapon of ridicule. I didn't answer. I didn't scold. I didn't even raise my eyes to meet hers. I simply sat there, my silence stretching across the room like a shadow she couldn't touch. She went on, as if silence were a green light for cruelty. "You should really stay in your room when I bring friends over. It's embarrassing." "I mean, you just sit here with those thick lenses like some relic from another century." Embarrassing. That word hung in the air. My own daughter, flesh of my flesh, looked at me not as her father, but as a burden, a blot on her social canvas. She gathered her papers, shoved them into her designer bag, and without another glance, she left. The door slammed, and the echo lingered longer than her footsteps. For a while, I just sat there. The television flickered with meaningless images, the clock ticked with indifference, and I remained frozen, staring at the space where she had stood. My glasses slid slightly down the bridge of my nose, and I adjusted them with a trembling hand. The world came back into focus, sharper than I wanted it to be. I saw the dust motes floating in the air, the faded family portrait on the mantel, the empty teacup on the table. It all seemed to mock me too, as if the house itself had joined in her laughter. I didn't cry. The tears had dried long ago after funerals, after disappointments, after arguments that ended with doors slamming instead of arms embracing. I didn't yell either. My voice had been wasted on years of advice no one listened to. I just got up, slowly, my knees stiff, my back aching, and walked out of my own house. The night air greeted me with a chill, and for the first time in decades, I realized I had no reason to rush back inside. I closed the door behind me, not gently, not angrily, but with the quiet finality of someone who knew he had just crossed an invisible threshold. As I walked down the empty street, the street I had once taught her to ride her first bicycle on, memories clawed at me. Her little voice calling, "Daddy, watch me!" Her tiny hands tugging at my pant leg. Her tears when she scraped her knee, and my kiss that made it better. All those moments lived within me, and yet she had reduced me to nothing with a single laugh. The betrayal wasn't in the words alone. It was in the years they erased, the sacrifices they mocked. I reached the park at the end of the road, the same park where I had once pushed her on the swings. The benches were empty, the grass damp with dew. I sat there, glasses fogging slightly with the night's breath, and I wondered if all parents eventually reach this moment, when love turns into a wound, and children become strangers wearing familiar faces. I wondered if my wife, gone now these many years, could see me from wherever she rested. Would she tell me to forgive? Would she tell me to fight? Or would she simply weep that her daughter's heart had hardened into stone? I stayed there until the streetlights blinked off with the coming dawn. Birds sang, oblivious to the wars of the human heart. My hands, wrinkled and veined, rested on my lap. My glasses, perched on my nose, reflected the rising sun. In that quiet hour, I made no vows, no dramatic declarations. I only knew this. Something had ended. Something had broken. And I could never go back to the man who sat in silence, while his own daughter mocked the very eyes that had watched over her all her life. I stood, walked back to the house and opened the door. It no longer felt like mine. Every picture frame on the wall seemed to whisper a lie. Every chair seemed to accuse me of wasting myself on a family that no longer cared. I took off my glasses, wiped the lenses carefully, and put them back on. The world sharpened again, harsh and unforgiving. I whispered into the empty air, "Not yet, but soon." The house had always been more than wood and nails to me. It was marrow and bone, skin stretched tight over the years of my labor. Every plank of flooring had heard our laughter. Every wall had absorbed our tears. I remembered the day I signed the deed, hands trembling with both pride and fear. My wife stood beside me, her smile radiant, clutching our little girl's hand. Back then, I believed this house would be the fortress of our love, the place where our children would always feel safe, where they would carry forward the story of our sacrifices. I built it not just for shelter, but for permanence, for legacy. And yet, standing in its rooms now, I felt like a guest in a museum of my own life. The kitchen was the heart of the home once. I could almost hear the echoes of pots clanging and my wife humming as she stirred the pot of stew that filled the air with warmth. The children used to run in and out, tugging at her apron, stealing pieces of bread before dinner. I remembered the smell of fresh pie cooling on the windowsill, the way my son would sneak slices and try to blame the crumbs on his sister, and how she would retaliate with shrieks that rattled the glassware. Those memories were stitched into every corner of that kitchen. Now the counters were cold, the air heavy with disuse, and the silence lay thick like dust no broom could sweep away. In the dining room, there was a long wooden table I had saved months of paychecks to buy. It wasn't the finest, but it was sturdy, a table meant to hold the weight of family. Every holiday, it overflowed with food, turkey, potatoes, bread, and laughter layered on top like the finest garnish. My wife at the head, me at the side, the children clamoring for the wishbone. I could still see my daughter, younger then, balancing on her chair to make a toast she barely understood, her words tumbling out with the innocence only a child knows. That same daughter now walked through this room with disdain, no memory of the feasts, no gratitude for the sacrifices that set that table in the first place. The hallway walls were lined with photographs, birthdays, graduations, family trips. Each frame told a story, and I had hung them with reverence, careful to level each one as though it were holy scripture. I remembered holding the ladder steady while my wife pinned the garland for Christmas, the children tossing tinsel at each other until the carpet shimmered with silver. Those nights we ended on the couch, exhausted, but with hearts so full that the walls seemed to expand with us. Now the photographs looked like strangers, smiling faces of children who once clung to me now regarded me with cold eyes when they came around. The same hallway that once smelled of pine and cinnamon carried only the faint scent of neglect. I walked upstairs, each step creaking like a groan of age. The bedrooms were doors to memory. In one room, my son had painted the walls blue, messy, brush strokes that I had helped smooth out. He had taped posters of baseball players, their signatures bright against the fading paint. I used to sit with him at night, explaining math problems, my glasses sliding down my nose as I leaned over his desk lamp. He used to say, "Thanks, Dad," before falling asleep with books scattered on the floor. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who rarely visited, who looked through me as if searching for someone else behind my tired eyes. And then there was her room, my daughter's. Pink walls, stuffed animals, fairy lights strung across the headboard. I remembered sitting on the edge of her bed, glasses perched on my nose as I read her stories, voices exaggerated to make her giggle. She would curl up against me, whispering that she wanted to be just like Mom when she grew up. That tenderness had once filled me with joy. Now, standing in that same room, I saw nothing but the shadow of what was lost. Her voice now was sharp. Her laughter cruel. The same lips that once kissed my cheek now twisted into mockery at the sight of me. The living room carried the deepest weight. The fireplace, dark now, once blazed with warmth during winters. My wife and I would sip coffee while the children sprawled across the rug, playing board games, their laughter weaving into the crackling fire. I had polished that mantel with my own hands, carved tiny initials into its edge the day we moved in. Our family's secret mark of belonging. I touched it now, fingers tracing the grooves worn by time, and it felt foreign, as though it had never belonged to me at all. Every corner of this house was proof of sacrifice. I had worked overtime shifts, sacrificed vacations, worn the same pair of shoes for years, all so the mortgage would be paid, so the roof wouldn't leak, so the children could sleep without fear. Each brick was bought with hours of my life I could never get back, and yet the ones I built it for had forgotten. To them, it was just a place to criticize, a backdrop to their disdain. They didn't see the sweat that had mixed with the cement, the late nights I had dragged myself home just to tuck them into bed, the years I had paid with my body and eyes so they could have more. I stood in the center of the house and listened. The silence was suffocating. No footsteps, no laughter, no music. Just silence, thick and oppressive, reminding me that love once lived here, but no longer. I realized then that my daughter had not only mocked my glasses, she had mocked everything they had helped me see, everything I had worked for. She mocked the life I had built around her. I looked at the photographs one last time, at the table, the chairs, the rooms, and the walls. They were ghosts, relics of a life that had ended without ceremony. My heart was heavy, not just with grief, but with the crushing truth that I no longer belonged here in the way I once did. My daughter had erased me from the home I had carved. Out of stone and sacrifice, it used to be filled with love. Now it echoed with silence. Money was never just money to me. It was hours of my life, measured in sweat and strain, exchanged for the chance to give my children something better than I had. Every paycheck was a promise, every receipt a testament of devotion. I still had shoeboxes filled with old slips, tuition, checks, down payments, utility bills, tiny scraps of paper that told the real story of my life as a father. When I looked at them, I didn't see numbers. I saw faces, smiles, milestones. I saw my daughter in her cap and gown, my son clutching his first set of car keys. I saw all the moments I had paid for with the currency of my own youth. I remembered the day I wrote the first tuition check for my daughter's college. My hand trembled slightly as I signed it, not because I lacked the funds, but because I knew what it meant. Another year of patched-up shoes for me, another season of worn-out jackets. I watched her drive away with the acceptance letter still, folded in her purse, her excitement shining brighter than the morning sun. She hugged me before leaving, arms tight around my neck, and whispered, "We'll always be there for you, Dad." I believed her. I held on to that sentence as if it were a vow signed in ink deeper than money. Graduation day was one of the proudest moments of my life. I stood in the crowd, glasses slipping down my nose, squinting just to keep her in focus as she walked across the stage. When they called her name, I clapped so hard my palms stung. She found me afterward, her eyes glistening, and wrapped her arms around me. "I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered. I thought that meant forever. I thought gratitude was a seed that would grow with time, not something that would wither the moment new soil appeared. That hug became a ghost, haunting me now when her words cut deeper than any blade. "You need to leave." It wasn't just tuition. There was her wedding too. She wanted the ceremony in a garden, with lanterns strung across the trees and a dress that shimmered like water. I told her it was too expensive, that we could scale it down, but the look in her eyes stopped me. I saw my little girl again, tugging on my sleeve, asking for just one more story before bed. So I signed the checks, drained the savings, and smiled through it all. On the day she walked down the aisle, she clutched my arm, whispering, "Thank you for everything, Dad." Her husband looked me in the eye, shaking my hand firmly, promising to cherish her, to honor the family I had raised. Yet years later, when I knocked on their door, it was that same man who said, "Maybe you shouldn't visit so often. It makes her uncomfortable." My son was no different. He wanted to buy his first home but couldn't afford the down payment. I co-signed the loan, dipped into my retirement, and handed him the keys with tears burning in my eyes. He hugged me, harder than he had since he was a boy, and said, "You're the reason we have this. I'll never forget it." But years passed, and the never became a silence. When financial troubles came knocking, it was my name on the papers, my credit. On the line, my phone that rang with threats from the bank. He had forgotten the promise, but the bank hadn't forgotten me. The receipts told their own story. I once pulled them out late at night, spreading them across the kitchen table like battle plans. There was the bill for braces, the invoice for a car repair, the tuition slips, the wedding payments, the endless list of things that kept them moving forward while I stood still. My glasses, those same lenses they mocked, helped me read the fine print no one else cared to see. Each number was a sacrifice. $300 for her books instead of a new winter coat for me, $1,500 for his medical bills instead of fixing the leak in the roof. Line by line, my love was written in ink the world never saw. I remembered, once after paying off yet another loan for my daughter, I found myself walking home in the rain, my shoes soaked through, holes widening with each step. She had called me the next morning, cheerful, thanking me in a tone that made it sound like I had given her pocket change. "You're the best, Dad," she said. I smiled through the phone, though my feet were still blistered from that walk. Gratitude, I thought then, was light enough to carry me through the pain. I didn't know it was also light enough to be forgotten. The metaphors were cruelly clear to me now. I had built a bridge of dollars and hours, carrying them across rivers of struggle. But once they reached the other side, they tore it down, leaving me stranded on the bank. I had poured water into their cups, never noticing mine was cracked and empty. I had given them the glasses through which they saw the world, only to have them laugh at the lenses that had strained to keep their futures clear. There were promises, so many whispered promises. "We'll take care of you, Dad. We'll always be by your side." They were spoken in moments of joy, in moments when gratitude overflowed. At graduations, weddings, dinners, they made me believe I wasn't alone. But now, those same lips told me coldly, "You need to leave." It was as if gratitude had an expiration date, and mine had long passed. I walked through the house one evening, receipts in hand, and stared at the photographs on the wall. Smiling faces looked back at me, preserved in frames I had bought, hanging on walls I had painted. Every smile had been purchased with my sacrifice. Every milestone had been bankrolled by my willingness to give. Yet none of those smiles remembered me. None of those milestones repaid me. Love, it seemed, had become a loan they never intended to pay back. I sat at the dining table, spread the receipts across its surface, and let my glasses bring them into focus one by one. I read each number, each date, each signature, as though they were entries in a holy book. I whispered aloud the words my children had once said. "We'll always be there for you, Dad." The house echoed with the memory, then with the cruel contrast. "You need to leave." The words collided in my chest, tearing something inside me that could not be stitched back together. I leaned back in the chair, the weight of decades pressing against my shoulders. I realized then that they hadn't simply forgotten me. Forgetting would have been mercy. No, they had rewritten the past entirely. They had taken every check, every bill, every sacrifice, and erased it from their memory as though it had never happened. They had turned my devotion into nothing more than background. Noise, easy to ignore, easier to dismiss. They didn't just forget me. They erased the debt I paid with love. The silence of the house had become unbearable, so I turned to the only company I knew I could trust. Paper. Receipts, statements, contracts. I gathered them from drawers, from boxes under the bed, from dusty files stacked in the study. My glasses slid down my nose as I bent over them, the same glasses that had once drawn my daughter's ridicule. They sharpened the world now, exposing what I had avoided for too long. Each page was a confession, each line a whisper of truths hidden in plain sight. The numbers did not lie, even if my children did. It began with a letter from the bank. Polite, at first, sterile in its phrasing, but laced with threat beneath the surface. Words like delinquency and outstanding balance glared at me through the lenses. I remembered my son asking me years ago to co-sign for his mortgage, the way his eyes had pleaded with me, the way he promised, "Just for the paperwork, Dad. I'll handle everything." I had believed him. A father wants to believe. Now the paperwork sat in my hands like a knife, and my name was carved into every blade. I walked into the bank the next morning. The marble floors echoed under my steps, and the young teller looked at me with polite indifference. I asked to see the manager, producing the letter. Soon I was led into a glass-walled office where a man in a press suit greeted me with a professional smile. He sifted through the records, tapping at his computer, and then his smile softened into pity. "Sir, as the co-signer, you're still legally liable for the remaining balance. Payments have not been made for several months." He slid the document across the desk toward me. My name, bold as betrayal, sat beside my son's, equal partners in responsibility. My son had defaulted, but it was I who carried the weight. From the bank, I went to the lawyer, an old colleague I had once trusted with the small matters of life, wills, property deeds, the unglamorous paperwork of aging. He greeted me kindly, but as he listened to my questions, his brow furrowed. "You should have been told about these defaults," he said, flipping through my files. "And there are more." He pulled out records I had never seen, credit cards in my name, loans I had co-signed without fully understanding the long-term implications. My daughter's wedding had been paid not only by my drained savings, but by borrowed funds she had promised to repay. Promises like ashes, carried away on the wind. Now the embers burned only in my accounts. I sat in his office for hours as he outlined the depth of the mire. There was a bankruptcy filing, not mine, but tied so tightly to my guarantees that the fallout clung to me. I saw the pattern clearly now. Each time they had smiled, each time they had hugged me with words of gratitude, they had also leaned on me for one more signature, one more favor. I hadn't just given them money. I had given them my name, my credit, my trust. And now those very gifts had turned into chains around my neck. When I left the lawyer's office, the world outside looked different. The sun was still shining, but to me it seemed sharper, crueler. The cars rushed by. People laughed at cafes. Life went on. But in my chest, something shifted. Grief was giving way to clarity. The fog of love had lifted, and beneath it lay a battlefield I had been blind to. My children had not only forgotten me, they had used me, manipulated me, tied their failures to my name as if I were nothing more than a safety net they could abandon once torn. That night, I returned home, spread the documents across the dining table once again, and studied them like a general poring over maps. The lines of debt, the signatures, the court notices, they formed patterns, strategies, betrayals woven with precision. I saw their fingerprints all over the destruction, and I realized with startling calm that I had been trained for this. My career had been built on details, on numbers, on contracts that could save or ruin. I had forgotten that side of myself in the years of raising them, in the softness of being a father. But the skills were still there, buried beneath sorrow. The same hands that had rocked them to sleep could just as easily dismantle the lies. They had spun. I picked up one contract and held it close to the light, the ink glinting like a scar. My glasses sharpened the clauses that trapped me, but they also revealed the loopholes, the avenues for retaliation. I realized that my children had mistaken my silence for weakness, my grief for blindness. They had thought I was a man fading, a relic mocked for his old glasses. They had forgotten who I had been before the years wore me down. I was not a relic. I was the man who had built this home, who had navigated banks and contracts long before they were born, who knew how to wield paper as a weapon sharper than any blade. As midnight approached, I leaned back in my chair. The house was still silent, but inside me, something new stirred. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was focus, the cold clarity of a man who had been underestimated for too long. They had mocked my glasses, but those lenses would now be the tools of their undoing. Every word on these documents was a thread, and I would pull until the whole fabric of their deceit unraveled. I whispered into the empty room, almost amused at the irony. They thought I was grieving. They forgot I was trained for this. I had spent decades being the provider, the man who signed checks and slipped into the background so others could stand in the light. But the years before fatherhood had forged me into something else entirely. Before I bent my back to the service of my children, I had been sharp. I had worked in ledgers and contracts, memorized statutes, advised men who thought they were untouchable until I showed them a line in fine print that unraveled their empire. Those years had felt distant, forgotten, until now. The betrayal that smoldered in my chest lit a fuse I hadn't touched in decades, and suddenly my mind hummed with the old clarity I thought had vanished with youth. I began by calling in old contacts. Men and women who had once sat beside me in boardrooms, who had studied the same books of law, who had trusted me with secrets of how to bend but not break the rules. Some had retired, some had climbed higher into power. But when they heard my voice, softened by age yet sharpened with intent, they remembered. I wasn't calling to reminisce. I was calling for records, for reports, for every thread of data that could bind my children to their debts. The bank manager who had once been a junior teller under my supervision now sat in a high-backed leather chair. He greeted me with deference, and when I asked for the loan history tied to my name, he didn't hesitate. Within hours, I had statements thicker than the family photo albums gathering dust on my shelves. Page after page, signatures stared back at me, my own, intertwined with my children's. But now, unlike the man who once signed out of love, I read them with a strategist's eye. I circled dates, highlighted clauses, noted discrepancies. Each page became a soldier in my arsenal. From there, I turned to the courthouse archives. My glasses magnified the scrolling black ink on parchment-like paper, and I combed through bankruptcy, Filings, lien notices, creditor reports. They had been sloppy. They had trusted that my silence meant ignorance, that my grief meant blindness. But I saw everything. I saw how my son had filed extensions, delaying payments, dragging my name deeper into obligation. I saw how my daughter's husband had leveraged credit built on my reputation to prop up a business that failed within months, leaving me tethered to the wreckage. I read every line, patient and precise, until the narrative of betrayal stood, as plain as scripture. Law had always fascinated me, not because of its rigidity, but because of its malleability. A contract was never just a contract. It was clay in the hands of whoever knew how to shape it. I contacted an old colleague, a lawyer, who still respected the sharpness of my mind. Over coffee in a quiet corner of the city, I laid out the papers, one after another. He leaned back, eyebrows raised. "They used you," he said simply, "but you can turn this back on them." He explained the avenues: breach of contract, fraudulent misrepresentation, recovery of debts. Every word was a weapon handed back into my hands. I spent weeks gathering, filing, organizing. I ordered credit reports not just for myself, but for them, legally accessible through the very ties they had bound me with. I mapped their defaults, their overspending, their debts spiraling like cracks in glass. I didn't move quickly. No, quickness was mercy. I moved slowly, deliberately, the way water carves stone. With each document I filed, I wasn't just preparing a case. I was sculpting justice. At night, I spread everything across the dining table again. The same table where birthdays once lit up the air. Now it was covered in folders, receipts, legal codes. I used colored tabs, neat handwriting, cross-references. My house, once echoing with laughter, now echoed with the scratch of my pen, the click of my calculator, the soft turning of pages. It was no longer a home. It was a war room. I remembered lessons I had taught my children when they were small, that every action had consequences, that promises were binding. They had laughed then, dismissing my words as lectures. But now they would learn those lessons written not in bedtime stories, but in legal documents sealed with their own signatures. Coldness seeped into me, but it was not cruelty. It was clarity. My hands no longer trembled when I wrote letters to creditors, demanding verification of debts. My voice no longer wavered when I spoke to clerks about court procedures. The man they had mocked as weak, pathetic, embarrassing was gone. In his place stood the strategist they had forgotten, the one who once untangled balance sheets and dismantled false empires. I realized then that revenge didn't need to roar. It needed to whisper, to flow silently into every crevice of their lives until they woke one morning and realized the walls were already closing in. And that was what I was building. Not a single blow, but a labyrinth of accountability, each turn narrowing until they faced me at its center. One evening, as I filed away another set of notarized copies, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. The glasses sat firm on my face, lenses glinting under the lamp. I thought of my daughter's laughter, the way she mocked them, and I almost smiled. These glasses, once the object of ridicule, were the reason I could see so clearly now. Through them, I wasn't just reading, I was unmasking, dismantling, reclaiming. People often think chess is about the pieces, the knights, the rooks, the queen. But I knew better. Chess was about foresight, about knowing the board so intimately that your opponent's every move was already accounted for. My children had been playing checkers while I had been patient, biding my time, remembering the rules they never bothered to learn. I closed the final folder of the night, hands steady, mind sharper than it had been in years. The silence of the house was no longer suffocating. It was satisfying, the quiet of preparation, the calm before revelation. I leaned back, whispering into the empty air with the weight of certainty. You don't play chess with someone who invented the board. The first sign came quietly, slipped into my mailbox like an afterthought. An envelope addressed to my daughter, but delivered here, where her name still lingered on some records. I opened it, not out of malice, but because it bore my liability as co-signer. The letter was from the bank, stamped with the word "declined" in bold red letters. A loan application rejected. I read the lines slowly, my glasses sharpening every word. Insufficient credit history. Excessive outstanding debt. It was the first crack in the glass facade she had so carefully polished for years. I folded it neatly and set it aside. I did not call her. I did not gloat. I simply added it to my growing archive. Soon after, word reached me of her husband's business. A restaurant, bright with ambition, had been their pride. They posted photographs on social media of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, smiling with champagne glasses raised. But behind the scenes, the numbers told a different story. Suppliers went unpaid. Rent checks bounced. I heard whispers from former employees who sought other jobs after paychecks stopped arriving on time. Then came the inevitable. A notice of default. The landlord locking the doors one morning with a thick chain. The lights going out on a dream built on borrowed funds. I watched from afar as my daughter's smile faded from the glossy photos, replaced by silence. My son fared no better. His mortgage, the one I had guaranteed, became a weight around his neck. Payments fell behind, warnings stacked like autumn. Leaves. I learned of arguments between him and his wife, their raised voices carrying into the street. Neighbors whispered of broken plates, of slammed doors. The man who once shook my hand and promised he would never forget what you've done now shouted at his wife about bills he couldn't pay. I heard from a friend at the bank that his applications for refinancing were denied. Every attempt to patch the sinking ship only widened the hole. I listened, not with joy, but with a strange calm. I had been the net they leaned on. Now, with that net gone, they fell. One evening, walking past the neighborhood where my son lived, I saw his car, once a polished status symbol, broken down by the curb, hood open, engine coughing. He stood beside it, cursing under his breath, while his wife sat inside, face buried in her hands. I kept walking. He didn't notice me. Or perhaps he did, and chose to ignore the shadow of the man whose name he had used to climb higher. Either way, I didn't stop. My footsteps echoed on the pavement, steady, unhurried, like the ticking of a clock that had finally caught up to them. It wasn't just finances. The unraveling bled into their lives like ink on paper. Invitations to social events dwindled. Friends who once filled their home for dinner parties stopped calling. My daughter, who once mocked my glasses for being out of fashion, now wore borrowed dresses and avoided eye contact in public. Her confidence cracked. I heard her voice tremble when she spoke to shopkeepers. Her credit cards declined at counters where she once purchased without hesitation. Pride turned into whispers of shame. I did nothing. That was the hardest part for them to understand. In the past, I would have rushed in, offering money, advice, a ride to the mechanic, a check slipped discreetly across the table. But now, I remained silent. I answered no calls, for none were made. I knocked on no doors, for none were opened. I became a ghost in their world, watching from the edges as the foundations they had built on my sacrifices crumbled beneath them. There was poetry in it, though a cruel kind. I had been the water that fed their roots, the rain that softened every drought of their youth. I had paid the bills, filled the cupboards, patched the roofs. They had mistaken that abundance for permanence, believing the rain would never stop. But I was not the rain. I was the well, and I had sealed myself shut. Now they walked thirsty, through deserts of their own making, parched by the very silence they once demanded from me. Foreclosure notices arrived next, thicker envelopes, heavier with the weight of consequence. I watched my son's house stripped of furniture, hauled out in trucks under the gaze of neighbors who shook their heads in pity. The same house I had helped him buy, the same roof I had promised would keep his family safe, now stood bare, windows boarded, a hollow shell of unkept promises. My daughter's car, once a gleaming luxury, was repossessed in broad daylight, her keys snatched from her hand as she pleaded with men who did not care for her tears. I saw them both, separately, unknowingly, stand outside in the cold, staring at what was gone, each with faces etched not only with loss, but with disbelief. Disbelief that the safety net was no longer beneath them. Disbelief that I had not rushed to catch them. Disbelief that life could be this merciless when for decades it had been merciful through me. The world, I realized, has its own rhythm of justice. Sometimes it roars, sometimes it whispers. In their case, it unfolded slowly, methodically, each denial, each repossession, each argument stacking like bricks in a wall around them. I did not build that wall. They had laid the first stones with their mockery, their betrayal, their dismissal of me. All I did was step back and let them finish what they had started. One night, as I sat at my dining table surrounded by files, I imagined them in their separate rooms. My son staring at empty cupboards, my daughter staring at unpaid bills. I imagined the silence pressing in on them as it had once pressed on me. The difference was simple. I had learned to endure silence, to find strength in it. They only found fear. I leaned back, fingers tracing the edges of a foreclosure notice I had filed away as evidence. My glasses caught the lamplight, the lenses glinting like sharpened steel. I whispered into the night, not with malice, but with a calm certainty that felt like truth itself. They thought I was the rain. I was the drought. They came back when the silence became too heavy to bear. It was a cold evening, the kind that carried the smell of smoke in the air when I heard the knock at my door. I knew the rhythm instantly, hesitant, uneven, a sound born not of courtesy but of desperation. I opened it to find my daughter first. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She tried to smile, but it quivered at the edges. Behind her stood my son, his shoulders slumped, the confident stride he once carried long since stripped away. "Dad," my daughter whispered, as if the word itself might break. "We need to talk." I stepped aside without a word. They walked in slowly, as though entering a place that once welcomed them, but now felt foreign. They looked around at the house, at the photographs, at the silence. It was the same home I had built for them, but their eyes carried the weight of shame. We sat in the living room, the air thick with words they didn't know how to shape. My son spoke first. Things have been hard. The bank, they won't listen to us anymore. They've taken the house, the cars, everything." His voice cracked on the last word. "We don't know where else to turn." My daughter leaned forward, her hands clasped as if in prayer. "Dad, you always said family comes first. You always said you'd be there no matter what. Remember when Mom was sick? You told us we'd get through anything together. Please, we need you." Now, just like before, she tried to weave the past into the present, tried to summon the ghost of the father who once emptied his pockets for them. She spoke of birthdays I had paid for, of hospital visits I had endured, of the nights I read to her when she was small. Her voice trembled as she dug deeper. "Mom would want you to help us. She wouldn't want to see her children suffer. Don't let us fall apart like this. Not after everything we've been through." My son's eyes burned with a different plea. "I've made mistakes, I know. But I'll make it right this time. I'll pay you back. I swear it. Just a little help. One loan, one payment. Please. You can save us." His words tumbled, desperate, as though speed could fill the empty promises between us. They spoke of love, of loyalty, of shared blood. They tried to pull me back into the old role, the provider, the rescuer, the father whose sacrifice was automatic, unquestioned. Their voices cracked, their hands shook, their eyes glistened. For once they were children again, not in age, but in their helplessness. And I sat in silence. I watched the way my daughter's lips trembled when she invoked her mother's memory, the way my son's fists clenched as if trying to hold on to a dignity slipping through his fingers. I heard every word, every plea, every echo of the past they tried to use as currency. But my face remained still. My glasses caught their reflections, two desperate figures, pleading not out of love, but out of need. The silence grew heavier than their words. My daughter's voice faltered. "Dad, please say something. Anything." Still, I said nothing. My son leaned forward, his voice rising, tinged with anger, born of fear. "So that's it? After everything you taught us, after everything you gave, you're just going to sit there and watch us fall?" I looked at him, steady, unmoved. He saw it then, the truth that words could not disguise. His shoulders sank. His head fell into his hands. My daughter began to cry, quiet sobs that filled the room where laughter once lived. I let the silence answer them. It wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. They had come not for reconciliation, not for love, but for rescue. They wanted the man who would hand them everything without question, who would sacrifice again and again until nothing was left of him but empty pockets and worn-out eyes. That man was gone. When their tears dried into silence, I finally spoke, my voice calm, colder than they had ever heard. I wasn't their family anymore. I was their creditor. They came again, not with tears this time, but with hollow eyes, worn down by the weight of their failures. I invited them in, gesturing, to the dining table where I had laid everything out. No food, no drink, no comfort. Only papers, neatly stacked, tabbed, and waiting like soldiers at attention. They sat cautiously, unsure whether this was mercy or judgment. My daughter glanced at the folders, her lips parting in confusion. My son shifted uncomfortably, trying to mask his unease. I slid the first document across the table. "This," I said quietly, "is the mortgage you defaulted on. Payment stopped 6 months before the bank informed me. You signed here, and here." I tapped the lines with my finger. Their eyes followed the movement like condemned prisoners. Watching the blade descend, next came the business filings. "The restaurant lease," I continued, laying down copies of bounced checks and eviction notices. "You used my credit to secure suppliers. You promised repayment. It never came." My daughter's face drained of color. She reached for the paper as though touching it might erase the ink. Then the credit reports, thick and damning. "Your defaults, your bankruptcies, your debts stacked on my name." I placed them in front of my son, who shifted back in his chair, his breathing shallow. "Every promise you made, broken. Every word of gratitude, erased." They tried to speak, but I raised a hand, silencing them. My voice remained calm, level. "I told you nothing when you begged. Not because I had nothing to say, but because silence speaks louder than lies. You thought I was weak. You thought age had dulled me. You thought grief had blinded me." I leaned forward, my glasses catching the lamplight, turning my eyes into shards of steel. But I was watching, and I was preparing. Their silence grew heavier with every page I laid down. Timelines, bank statements, legal notices, all arranged with surgical precision. They saw it then. The revenge had not been a single blow, but a slow tightening of a noose woven from their own actions. They had not fallen by accident. They had been dismantled piece by piece, each collapse another stitch in the tapestry I had designed. My daughter finally whispered, voice breaking, You planned this. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply stacked the last folder, tapped it once and said, I documented everything. Every signature, every debt, every betrayal. You thought I was grieving. I was calculating. The room was still, save for the sound of their breathing, shallow and uneven. I could feel the shift, the moment when power changed hands completely. They were no longer my children sitting at that table. They were defendants, petitioners, supplicants, and I was no longer their father. I was the one they had underestimated, the architect of their reckoning. I leaned back, folded my hands, and let the silence stretch until it broke them. Then, with a calmness sharper than any shout, I spoke the words that ended the illusion once and for all. Let's talk terms. The silence after my words lingered, heavy as stone. My daughter shifted in her chair, her hands trembling against the edge of the table. My son tried to look defiant, but his eyes betrayed him, darting toward the stacks of evidence as though searching for escape. There was none. I placed a single sheet of paper in front of them. You want help? You'll earn it. My daughter leaned forward, scanning the words. Her face flushed. A public apology? You can't be serious. I am, I replied. You. Will write it, sign it, and read it aloud to the family you shamed me in front of. You mocked me, belittled me, erased me. The world you wanted to impress will now hear the truth. Without that, there's no discussion. She recoiled, her pride stinging louder than her desperation. My son grabbed the page, skimming further. His jaw clenched. Legal contracts? Giving you power of attorney over my finances? You're asking to control everything. I'm asking to prevent another collapse, I said evenly. You will not borrow another dollar without my approval. You will not sign another document without my oversight. If you want rescue, you surrender control. This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability. My daughter shook her head, her voice rising. That's humiliation. It's justice, I corrected. I gave you freedom, and you destroyed it. Now freedom must be earned back inch by inch. I placed another page on the table. Therapy appointments already scheduled. You will both attend, weekly, individually and together. The arrogance that led you here wasn't born of poverty. It was born of pride. Until that pride is broken, no amount of money will save you. Their silence was loud. Anger trembled in my son's shoulders. Tears welled in my daughter's eyes. They resisted, clinging to scraps of dignity, trying to summon the old balance where I was the one who yielded. That world no longer existed. You're treating us like criminals, my son spat. No, I said softly. Criminals face prison. You face me. For a moment, they looked as if they might walk out, preferring ruin to submission. But ruin had already stripped them bare. Pride cannot fill empty stomachs. Pride cannot pay debts. And pride cannot open doors once closed by creditors. Slowly, inevitably, their resistance broke. My daughter nodded first, her voice barely audible. Fine, I'll do it. My son followed, slamming the pen against the contract as he signed, fury burning in his eyes. You'll get what you want. I slid the final document toward me, their signatures still wet, binding them more tightly than any bloodline ever could. From my pocket, I drew a check. The amount was enough to keep them afloat, not enough to make them comfortable. I held it between my fingers, letting the silence hang one final time. Then I placed it on the table, slowly, deliberately, like a verdict delivered. They reached for it, desperate, but I held their eyes. Remember this, I said, my voice low, unshaken. Mercy isn't free. The house was quiet again, but the silence no longer hurt. It felt clean, almost sacred, like air after a storm. For years, I had walked these halls with heaviness, each room echoing with memories that cut instead of healed. Now, those echoes seemed softer, stripped of bitterness. Justice had a way of scrubbing wounds raw before they finally closed. I sat in my chair by the window, the same chair my daughter once mocked as old-fashioned. The lenses on my glasses caught the evening light, sharpening every detail. The eye, dust dancing in the air, the faint crease in the curtains, the glow of sunset painting the walls. I breathed deeply, not out of weariness, but out of peace. On the mantel, a photograph waited. My wife's face smiled at me through the years, her eyes holding the same quiet strength she had carried into every room. I rose slowly, joints aching but steady, and touched the frame. "You'd understand," I whispered. "You'd know this wasn't revenge. It was balance. It was the justice you always said would come if I only waited long enough." For a moment, I let the memories wash over me. Her laughter in the kitchen, her hand in mine as we painted the children's rooms, her voice telling me not to give too much, not to lose myself in sacrifice. I had ignored her wisdom then, but tonight, I felt she was here, standing beside me in the silence, nodding as though she approved of what I had done. I walked through the house one last time, slowly, like a man touring a gallery of his own life. The dining table where contracts now sat had once held birthday cakes. The stairs creaked under my weight, as they had under my children's when they snuck down at night. Every wall bore fingerprints of a past that was both sweet and bitter, but I was no longer shackled to it. I had reclaimed these rooms, not by force, but by patience. Outside, the world still spun. My children now lived under contracts, under conditions they never imagined. They thought they had broken me, reduced me to a frail figure hidden behind glasses. But now, they couldn't move without my permission. They couldn't breathe financially without my hand on the pen. Their independence had turned into dependence, their pride into obedience. I did not smile at their downfall. That was never the point. My revenge was not their suffering, it was their recognition. They knew now who I was, who I had always been. The foundation beneath them was mine, and when they spat on it, I took it back piece by piece until they stood with nothing. Only then did they understand. I returned to my chair, lowering myself carefully, the weight of years settling into comfort instead of strain. I set the photograph of my wife beside me, her presence a quiet anchor. The night descended, slow and gentle, wrapping the house in stillness. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a relic in my own home. I felt like its master again. Justice doesn't always roar, sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it walks on quiet feet, carrying no sword, only patience sharpened into something stronger than steel. Tonight, justice had no bitterness, it had no fire. It was simply here, filling the silence with peace. I adjusted my glasses, the eye, same lenses once mocked, and let the world sharpen around me one last time. Then I spoke into the quiet, not for them, but for myself, and for the memory of the woman who once told me never to mistake kindness for weakness. They wanted me. Gone. Now they can't move without me. Kindness is not weakness. It's patience, weaponized. Justice wore the scent of roses this year.